Thank you.
So maybe we'll just do a quick little introduction. I'm Karin Hess. A lot of people in New Hampshire are familiar with the work I've done with the SBAC, and before that, the NECAP assessment design, and with my rigor matrix and with the PACE work. So a lot of work with performance assessment going back many years. And I'll pass it to Rose.
Good. Hi, I'm Rose Colby. As mentioned, I've been doing quite a lot of work in the field of competency-based education, working with helping schools design systems that are better able to meet student needs and build agency with students. Worked extensively in New Hampshire. I know many of you on the call I've connected with as I did work in those districts. I'm very happy to be here to shed a little bit of light on how CBE is actually an amazing solution for anywhere learning, whether you're learning remotely, virtually, or face-to-face. It still is best able to meet the needs of individual students to get them ready for higher ed or the workplace. Dan.
All right, thanks, Rose. My name is Dan Joseph. Just a little bit about myself. Worked in high schools in Maine and elementary schools in Maine when they were working for the proficiency-based diploma and standards-based grading. Quickly found myself leading a school and supporting a district in it was a lab school for the next generation learning. We were that alpha lab school, so we had a lot of opportunities to work on personalized learning or personal mastery in terms of proficiency-based. And then at that point, I ended up working for Reinventing Schools Coalition around the country, which was bought out by Marzano Research. Continuing to work, I've had a lot of opportunities to work with schools and systems in really bringing about educational structures and systems that are focused on the interaction between knowledge students and teachers, and really finding that sweet spot. And in my work, I was using Rose's framework and a lot of Karin's tools. And we just really started to talk, and we're really kind of looking at, and I don't want to steal Rose's thunder, but literally we're looking at a framework that we feel can be applied in an intentional way to help move systems and districts in the direction that you potentially want to go. And having said that, I went backwards. Having said that, our focus for today is we're going to look at these three areas of shift. And this is kind of like the framework of the book as well, which is truly a toolkit. We're going to look at organizational shifts, teaching and learning structures, and as well as that student-centered classroom. And in looking at those three shifts for today, what brings us together is we want to kind of think about these questions. And we wanted to look at the system and not know that everybody starts at the same place and ends at the same place, but there's truly a pathway. We're going to try to give you a glimpse at what that pathway is and help you maybe think about what your entry points are and what your leverages are. And we also want to think about, as we think about that, we also want to look at the challenges and opportunities that technology affords us. And we're going to do that through the lens of a competency-based design. And I think one of the things that I continually hear as I work with schools, and in particular, I'm working with Manchester School District right now, the challenge is we know technology should allow us to personalize learning, but why is it so difficult? What's the disconnect? And then the last one is how does shifting to personalized competency-based approaches provide usefulness for school year this year and beyond? I think COVID has kind of pulled back the curtain on some of our system challenges or shortcomings. We don't want to just do an interim fix, but maybe this is an opportunity to really look at more deep systemic challenges that confront us in education. And with that, I do want to talk about our book, and the book is truly a toolkit, and the toolkit is really based on a systemic application of change and transformation. And what we're looking at is at the leadership level, the instructional level, the student level, and kind of in a more comprehensive organizational level. How can you identify where you are and where you want to go? And we're going to be looking at those through those 3 shifts I just mentioned. It is a toolkit. It is designed to almost like choose your own adventure. And one of the tools that we would invite you to open up and look at it is just basically these readiness scales. Helps you identify in those core areas of CBE design. Where are you? Where are your strengths? Where are your challenges? And it helps you identify what that first step is. Also within that book, as we're thinking about these systemic changes and these strategies and these changes in mental models and behaviors, we're always going to refer back to Hattie's visible learning. And these are the core, those of you just really quick, these levers or these high yield influences, 0.4 or greater, Hattie basically talks about as initiatives, strategies, or behaviors that offer maximum return for input. So if it's 0.4 or greater, he definitely feels that you should be employing them. And if you look at this, you will see we have aspects of the student owning their learning, identifying where they are in their learning. We also have aspects where the teacher has to be very clear as to what the success criteria is, or the learning intention in terms of that level of clarity. And then we have the interplay of the student being aware of themselves as learners, their metacognition, using feedback to fuel themselves, to keep themselves moving forward. So throughout the book and throughout this conversation today, as we bring about strategies, we're going to try to revisit you back to that meta-analysis and research as a value-added, time-saving strategy or behavior. And I believe Rose, oh no, this is mine stuff. So I want to just do what? Don't stop.
Still talking, Dan. Keep talking.
I know. We've done this so much.
Dan,
I think I should know this by now.
You should. I just put a note in the chat that I wasn't sure if this had been posted yet. So it's on my website. If you go to my archive page, it will take you to the PowerPoint.
Okay, good. Thank you. So basically, the way we've organized the book and the tools is not just around the conceptual components of CBE, which Rose will talk about next slide, but we really wanted to focus on the shifts because we're really going into transformational. And the shifts for us, we look at them as three integrated gears. The first one is the organizational shifts. Those would be policy, leadership, professional culture, and professional learning. Rose will be walking through those in depth. And then there's teaching and learning shifts, which are those academic competencies, personal success skills, performance assessments, grading, reporting. And Karin will be walking through those with us. And then at the third one is the student-centered classroom, which is the core instruction, pacing, and assessment. And I'll be walking through those. But what we want you to understand is you can make a policy change, but if you don't address the instructional strategies or the instructional opportunities or provide training for that instruction, that policy is just going to be that. It has to be brought into reality and with thoughtfulness around how is that policy shift driving a teaching and learning shift? And how does that teaching and learning shift ultimately drive something that's going to impact or change in the classroom? And I dare say, since March of last year with COVID, we've had to really think about attendance, scoring, grading, and all of those shifts really pushed out into each one of these gears. And that's what our hope is through conversations today. We'll have a better understanding of those shifts. And this is Rose.
Yeah. So with this, I think one of the very important resources that I hope you will become familiar with in time is the Aurora Institute. It used to be called INACOL, and they really have been the major organization, if you will, that has stepped forward with CBE over the past many years that we've been involved with this. And recently, what we have seen emerge, and I do want to address why CBE has been such a responsive way to deal with the COVID issues that have come out, is that what we found is that in a nutshell, is that traditional systems of teaching and learning and of administration aren't resilient enough or haven't been in order to really move our kids from face-to-face teaching and learning into this new world, be it hybrid, where kids are in and out of school, or totally remote. And what we've seen, and the data is starting to point in this direction, especially at the high school level, is that kids are basically shutting out. They're tuning off. They'll log in, and they log in because there's an attendance policy that requires them to log in, and they simply turn their screens off, and they don't engage. So I'm not sure that that's a whole lot different than kids who actually go to school. And not that I've seen too many of these, but I've seen a fair share in high school of kids who are basically sleeping on their desks, and they aren't engaging. So we have the same problems, be it face-to-face or remote, that we have to find a renewed sense of agency with kids. Agency really means that a kid can really speak about what they've learned. They can actually make decisions about what the next steps in their learning are, but they have to be learning in a different way. And so there's a really excellent article. It just came out, and the resource is quoted here. Again, it's if you just go to Aurora, you'll see it in their research briefs. And I think Karin has put a link in this presentation for it also. But this quote really kind of drew me in. During a transition to remote or distance learning, we need a renewed sense of agency. They have to understand what they're going to learn and how they demonstrate their learning. Teaching them up and testing is no longer the answer. Our higher ed, our colleges, and our workplaces really demand that kids walk into those places and can be independent. All right, and that's really what we look at in our vision and profile of the graduate. Most people, when they do that profile, they really basically come out with a lot of the same characteristics. They want their kids at graduation to be critical thinkers, to be independent learners, to be able to collaborate at high levels. And we have to shake hands with that contract we're making with our parents and our community, that we're actually teaching them how to do those things, and not just assuming that because they're doing academic learning that they're getting that. They have to know how to ask for assistance, exhibit self-direction and efficacy when working on assignments. We're going to be talking a lot about the resources around self-direction today. They have to own their work and put forth their best efforts. And that's really what student agency is at play. Okay, Dan, if you want to move that forward. All right. And basically, when we look at these action steps, like we said, the architecture for CBE schooling, we see it as systemic, not as one particular, practice that a teacher does in the classroom, whether it be using technology or not. It's like a spider's web that you look at across your organization. And whenever you think of doing one piece, it's usually connected to something else in that architecture. And we see those different pieces of change throughout your system as a series of changes that represent a shift. Okay, so we've identified the 3 shifts that we see schools and districts needing to attend to as they do their work over multiple years. This isn't a quick fix. All right, you start with a quick fix to help with an emerging problem that you have, but it leads you to look at other pieces. And our role in doing our books and the work that we do within districts is to really raise your awareness about the very unique situations you have going on in your district to address all of these pieces. So action steps really involve what we know. This isn't anything new to you, except I think the last several months have really brought into education something that's very foreign, and that's the need to pivot. You had to pivot quickly from face-to-face instruction into something else. We know now that the districts that simply took their traditional formats and put it online is not a model that works. Kids aren't working very well with it. Why? Because it's an equity issue. We think we address equity in our face-to-face teaching and learning, but it's a whole different dimension of thinking about equity issues when kids are learning from home, learning with grandparents. I know I had to do a our little grandson is 4 years old, and I had to do his preschool Zoom lesson with him the other day. I know what parents are going through, okay, and have talked to a lot of parents that are in this position, but you have to keep families much more in the loop now than ever before. Okay, we have to design lessons that links with student interest the same way you do in your classroom. You have to check for learning along the way, which really speaks to those rich formative assessment systems that Karin is talking about. And really, I'm going to spend a little time on equity because we have to do this. We have just overlooked the equity pieces of the choices and decisions that we make about learning. And also, we can't forget our professionals. We have to think about equity with our professionals as well. Dan, you can move it forward if you would. So what we see, and again, the framework is really based on the work that the architecture book that I did, and we use this architecture a lot across systems. There's nothing magical about it. It means that you have to think very broadly about your competencies, K through 12. They have to be measurable. Which means collecting a body of evidence, right? It has to be rigorous. That's what a competency is. It's a statement that really captures that application of learning. They have to be transferable. What you learn in the classroom has to go elsewhere. And it empowers student learning, and that's the agency. But we actually do separate academic competencies from those personal success skills. And we have a wide body of research around these also. David Conley's work, Linda Darling-Hammond's work, all speaks to what are those other characteristics. New Hampshire identifies communication, collaboration, creativity, and self-direction, which are research-based pieces that say these are the pieces that higher ed and the workplace require of our kids. We can't just expect that parents teach kids these things. We have to embrace these and make this part of our teaching and learning all along the way, so that that vision of the graduate actually is realized. That we say, what did they get at the handshake at graduation? It has to be all of these things, right? But the only way we can do this is really looking at a variety of different ways of assessing kids with real clear criteria and expectations and processes that we use across the system, K through 12. All right. And Karin, who's been such a national and international expert on this, we're very fortunate to have her, lend her expertise around what performance assessment actually means in this very systemic approach to CBE and school change. And finally, the learning pathways. Okay, more and more we have to break down those academic silos, especially at the high school level. We see a lot of change happening at elementary and middle schools. In fact, the middle school model in its best form actually has lent itself to a lot of the supports for our professionals. In high schools, do some work around creating student learning communities to really facilitate that work. But these learning pathways can actually be a way for students to engage in professional pathways that they can follow. Again, the workplace is changing and higher ed is really changing. We can't use old thinking and what our old models of what higher ed expects or the workplace expects. As educators, we have to really know what those things look like now. And that's where I really like to engage a lot of counseling in departments, especially at the high school level, to really up their game and get involved with the changes at higher ed. That's a whole other series of webinars I think that we need to do because it's really that important. Okay, Dan, if you want to move it. So I'm going to focus just on the first piece of the organizational shifts and really put a focus on these shifts using a lens of equity on this. Policies are very important, and I know a lot of you are district folks, and you really understand how policy drives so many decisions at the board level. And we have to be sure that as we look at changes, you really have to look at your policy and do a really good screening activity to be sure that you don't have pieces of policy that are going to fly in the face of the changes that you want to have happen. Okay, and so we need to shed light on that, because we're finding, for example, issues where there's attendance policies in place that don't fit with competencies. In fact, our laws in New Hampshire, as well as some other states, say if a student demonstrates competency, then that's the grade they get. All right, you can't say, oh well, they passed their competencies, but they failed the course because they exceeded an absentee policy. You've got to pay close attention to that. Leadership is different. What we have found in our districts who've been doing this work across the country, and we know this through our work with Competency Works and Aurora, doing deep research studies on this, that leadership models have to change. If you are using a typical hierarchical, and some people would say patriarchal design for your leadership teams, you got to flatten it. You've got to distribute your leadership so that actually teachers are taking a much stronger part in participation in making decisions around teaching and learning. That's their expertise. So we have to look at how do we distribute that leadership model where the decision makers are actually the ones who are contributing to decision making, because they're closest to the students and are best able to make the wisest decisions around the teaching and learning models. Our professional culture has to change. We've seen in these last 6 months the number of people who are walking away from our profession because that professional culture isn't being honored when it switched to virtual. We have to nurture and build our professional cultures differently, and certainly allow our professional learning communities to take on those roles within the structure of teaching and learning that they have governance over. And then we have to nurture our teachers in very different ways. I don't think giving them, free breakfast in the morning is the way to get a positive culture, or giving them a t-shirt that says teachers are wonderful. That isn't what I'm talking by culture. We're talking about embedded practices around the relationship between teachers and between leaders within the district and teachers. Okay, listening to their concerns and responding to it. And that means that we're looking at ways in which we have got to, we immerse teachers into many situations they weren't prepared for. They didn't have the necessary learning that they needed, okay, in order to pull off remote learning. That just the yourselves. I mean, this is all about technology, right? Those teachers who were very, very reticent to use technology in their classrooms, it was like throwing in the deep end of the pool. All right, and they didn't have anything to save them. All right, and they just wallowed in this. So how do we create learning opportunities where they learn by doing, where they actually look at learning for professionals the same way we look at learning for kids? We know that kids who struggle with something need to be scaffolded. All right, and so how do we scaffold learning and personalized learning for teachers? All right, in order to do this, we're very fortunate that Southern New Hampshire University is now offering graduate programs for master's as well as CAGS degrees, and we have several other universities nationally that are doing this, that are offering these advanced degrees in CBE and everything about CBE. But you know what? It takes time to get involved, and not everybody can do a graduate degree. How do we bring that learning home to our professionals? And this is an organizational shift. We've got to pay attention to that as a big part of the efforts and funding, especially funding, that we bring to our teachers every day. So these are really the systemic shifts that we see as organizational shifts. And to put kind of a need, an immediate need, is to really use these pieces to think through, especially with that policy issue, the equity issues that are at play. Dan, go ahead to the next one. There's a lot that a lot has to do with what's gone on in our country over the last several years. We hear a lot in the news around systemic racism. We hear a lot in the news about equity. But what does it mean in in our education field. And again, within education, there's a lot being discussed, written, and shared with on a lot of different different boards, different webinars. It seems to be the topic of interest right now, and I simplify things. Okay. And in simplifying, if we can just understand what equity means, and I'm just focusing on kids and their learning, but also think about the professional piece too. Our duty as educators is to ensure that each child is successful, okay, in their learning. All right. We can have a good discussion of what successful looks like, but what we have to say, a child can only be successful if they have equal access, full access, okay, full access and opportunity, as well as pathways to their success. Access, opportunities, and pathways for success. Whatever it takes, whatever it takes. I worked with a school district in Kentucky, one of the largest school districts. They had over 30,000 kids in the district. Kentucky is by county some of the most neediest counties in the United States. And all of a sudden, they had to go remote. They ended up spending 2 to 3 months not only bringing technology to kids, but working with parents and working with kids to use it. And then the technology was there, but the internet access wasn't. So they put their buses out into the communities, into the rural communities, and created hotspots for kids to connect to. Okay, so what that means is it isn't enough to say we're going remote and we're going to support the kids that are remote, which kids can't. You can't run a regular school day schedule when kids are remote because parents have to work remotely in many cases. They have multiple siblings to work with, and sometimes there isn't enough technology in the home for the parents to work and the kids to be working remotely at the same time at home. Okay, so how do you uncover all of these different factors? Really takes a different kind of engagement with our community to seek out what those issues are that are in the way of equity. But it is our responsibility, okay, to uncover those and to deal with them, whatever it takes, so that each child is successful. You know, you're not being successful when kids aren't engaging. Okay, you can't blame it on the parents, you can't blame it on the kids. It's up to us to really look at ourselves and say, what do they need? It's whatever it takes. Okay, and again, we have a lot of resources to help us. Okay, I look at it this way, and I look at it whether we're face-to-face or whether you're remote. In order to drive change within your district, especially if you have that traditional format, these 4 pieces are 4 very, very important pieces to consider. Time. Okay, what didn't work is taking a school schedule based on a 7-period day, 45 minutes a day, and putting it online for kids. Doesn't work. Okay, how would you use time differently? Well, what we know about what does work in our CBE systems that are more advanced, and we have several in New Hampshire that are, okay, we found that when they schedule bigger blocks of time with small groups of teachers working with clusters of kids, they use their time better. They're using asynchronous learning more productively. They're using their talent differently. Okay, the model of one teacher for 24 kids teaching multiple subjects doesn't work very well. I'd say it doesn't work very well in many cases face-to-face as well as remotely. I've spoken about technology. How do you use those different pieces of technology, right? And resources. All right. And our resources now are really more and more speaking to us, using our resources in our community, using our experts nationally who have been doing this work for numbers of years, seeking out different ways to use resources for that professional learning becomes really important. Dan? So we're going to pause right now and ask you to think about, can you go back just for a second? Thanks, Dan. if you have any questions or answers about that first piece of the organizational shifts, we really, invite you to, put some questions in the chat. It's being monitored. We'll be sure to bring these up as we'll address those questions as we continue on with this today. But really kind of think about what's the logical entry point for your organization to really address the systemic shifts to CBE. Okay. Okay, Dan, go ahead.
And now we move on to the second focus area, teaching and learning. So as Rose was talking about policy, you can see that policy is going to be influenced by how you write your competencies, how you assess the competencies, how you make decisions about grading and reporting. So a lot of times schools we've worked with want to start in one area like assessment or grading, but it's pretty obvious of the interrelatedness of these four areas. So when we talk about academic, we're talking about the content-based competencies. When we talk about the personal success skills, those are some of those skills. Some schools call them 21st century. They sometimes encompass social emotional learning skills. There are skills that you've identified in your profile of the graduate. And I'm not going to go into detail in this session, but I did a session about how to incorporate both of those types of competencies when you develop your performance assessments that are competency-based. And unless you have those pieces in place, you can't really talk about how you're going to change grading and reporting, because you need data that's competency-based, not necessarily just standards-based. Let's go to the next slide. So we have this visual, a typical, and we've all done work with standards-based curriculum. So typically we say, let's divide the standards across the curriculum. Let's develop units of study. Let's assess each unit of study, and we'll be sure to hit all of the prioritized standards and the supporting standards. That's not a bad model, but we want you to think of it a little bit differently now. Next. So this idea of a learning pathway or a learning progression, I've done a lot of work with looking at learning progression, says that all kids aren't in the same place along their progression of learning, but curriculum doesn't seem to address those differences. I see so many articles now about kids having deficits. Well, maybe it's the way we've outlined our curriculum that has the deficits, because if we build our curriculum along of learning progression, we know if they're ready to move on. And so we'll talk a little bit about how you can make this shift. Next. So a way to think about this progression is to think about all the different ways we might be assessing kids, and then connect the pieces, because a lot of times we want them to be at those higher levels of performance assessment. We want them to do ELOs. We want them to do performance tasks. We want them to do project-based learning. If you want to hit that one more time, Dan. So project-based learning is pretty far up on that continuum. But if we want kids to perform at those higher levels, we need to go back and say, well, what are the daily learning targets that we're building on to see if they're ready to move on? I've actually been doing a series with a district. I do a lot of work with New York City school districts. And we've been talking about how do you build that scale so that if you want them to end up in a project that's student directed, what are the skills needed to get them there successfully? So now we're thinking of the learning progression and how we're going to assess that learning with different types of performance assessments. That's what builds your body of evidence. Next. So we use the term performance scale. You will see proficiency scale also used in the literature. But very specifically, we decided to go with a performance scale because there's performance at all levels along that scale. A performance scale for a competency, and we'll show you an example, guides how you design your assessments and in turn influences the instructional supports that are needed, going from less complex to more complex tasks that are clearly connected. When we follow a written curriculum, sometimes there isn't that clear connection. That's when kids say, why are we learning this? If you could make a clear connection and say, well, you need to be able to do this when you begin to design your performance task. They're task neutral. That means that a performance scale isn't written so that you can do a project about environmental science. It's a performance scale that says you're going to conduct research, design your own research question, collect data so that you can use it in science class, but you could also use it in social studies and other classes. So a task neutral scale is flexible enough to design many assessments that are comparable at those different steps on that range of tasks. And then the third key idea here is now we can think about grading a little bit differently. We're taking evidence from each level of those stair steps. And what level are students working on at any given point in time? Are they still working on the less complex tasks? I always quote a teacher from Concord CTE Center. I've done a lot of work with them, and one of the auto tech teachers said to his students, you know, you can be a rock star at those lower level tasks. That doesn't make you competent. And so they're trying to get kids to see that just because you can change tires appropriately or check the oil, you'll never be hired as the service manager in a shop if you don't build problem solving skills and you don't bring those skills with you to do something more complex. So now we can think about grading not as averaging scores, but what kinds of tasks are you able to perform? Next. So here would be an example of a performance scale on the left side, and it's got steps along that scale for conducting research. So I can gather information. That's least complex. Now I can analyze where that information came from, a little bit more complex. I can interpret and communicate what I learned. And then at the highest end, now I can reflect on what I've learned. I can personalize the meaning of it. I can go back and say, this is how I could make it stronger or better. So there's a lot of self-direction and metacognitive skills built into that scale. Over on the right side, if that's my scale, then I need scoring criteria for research skills, the ability to determine validity, to be able to analyze impact of the information that I'm presenting to my audience, and self-reflection. That might not be one rubric, it might be more than one rubric. And in the middle, you see, so what performance task would do that? And if we had a little bit more time, I'd ask everybody to suggest a task where kids are gathering information, checking the accuracy, interpreting their findings, and reflecting on learning. I'll bet with the number of people, I see there's 38 people on this today, I'll bet everyone could come up with something that wouldn't exactly be the same, but that's the idea of a task neutral scale that is scored in a similar way, but the content can be specific to the situation a student is in. Right before we started, we were talking with Chris Martin, aka Martin. She was talking about how some of her students leave school to go work for a family business. Well, if you built competency scales that would allow them to use that work experience as an internship, they could reflect on learning, they could show what they've learned, and that could form a new type of performance task if you had policies that allowed for that. Next. So here's an example that came from a district that I worked with 2 years ago now. This is a Proviso East High School, is just outside of Chicago, and they built performance scales around a competency for using rhetorical strategies. And the team that came to the workshop, came virtually to the workshop, were ELA and humanities teachers. But when they took their task draft back to their colleagues said, well, we could do this in the STEM program. we could do this in the business program. We could do this across the school. So the resulting changes took that same scale, annotating examples, comparing examples, using Flipgrid to give peers feedback, and then creating their own ways of using rhetorical strategies, but they're either creating an advertisement, a political promise, or a scientific statement that's debatable. And then they all ended with writing a reflection on their learning. So same scale, same competency, very unique ways. And within that, and we have this example a little bit more expanded in the book, but students are making a lot of decisions about what examples they want to assess, what they want to create, what the final product is going to look like. So a lot of student agency and choice within the competency-based framework. And this is the way kids across the school can collect evidence for grading and reporting. Okay, and thanks. Rose just put a little note about, you can learn more about Proviso East. It's not a school where kids have no issues. There are a lot of high-risk kids in the district, so they've been doing a really good job to bring everyone along. I'm going to just briefly mention that I worked last year with the New Hampshire Learning Initiative to develop sort of a revised look at self-direction, and the BEST toolkit is now posted. It takes some of those work practices that New Hampshire has been assessing, but it aligns them with the learning progression research about self-direction, how it develops over time. It makes it kid-friendly language, and everything is stated in the positive, where before there were some statements where you're not handing your work in on time, where now it's talking about, well, what does it look like when you're not handing your work in on time? So if you haven't seen those, you may want to check those out. And like I say, there are ways to bring those together with your academic competencies as you build assessments. Next. So just very quickly, at the bottom of this pyramid, we have the daily learning target. So if you think back to the Proviso East example, those are parts of the competency. I learned the terms of rhetorical strategies. I can recognize rhetorical strategies. I can compare how they're used. All of that is used in planning daily lessons and deciding, are kids ready to move on? Once kids are ready to move on, you start to build the summative assessments, which embody more than one competency. So that might be an academic and a personal success skills competency. There might be multiple ways students can show what they know. And now you're drawing from, not using what's at that bottom level of the pyramid to decide the grade, but you're saying you're now performing in the summative assessment, the more complex task. And to build the student's body of evidence, they might have some say in what goes into their body of evidence, what reflects their best learning, because there's a lot of student designed assessments as well as student reflection on their own learning. And we can, if any of those things intrigue you, please feel free to put a question or comment in the chat. I do go into a little bit more detail in the other breakout session that I did, but we're happy to answer questions. And I'll pass things to Mr. Joseph.
Thank you, Karin. Rose has talked about the organizational structures, making sure kids have a laptop, make sure our policies are capturing learning in a different venue. Karin has given us what's important for students to know and be able to do, and how we know and they've done it. Now, the last area is how do we make sure that our core instruction is that transfer of knowledge? How do we change the role of teaching and learning, or the teacher and the student? And I'm going to kind of just use one slice when I think about an online learning environment or a hybrid learning environment. I'm thinking one of the key aspects the teacher needs to do is kind of let go. Really let go of the pace. the one size fits all instructional. Let go. And in letting go, most teachers won't let go. But in letting go, I think we have to give students tools, metacognitive tools, organizational tools to really be independent learners. Or they could even be collaborative learners minus that direct approach of the teacher. So when I'm talking about that change in role of shifting the focus of learning around the teacher to the student, you can see how that's going to change core instruction. Core instruction needs to be just right instruction. If it's too hard, they won't engage if I'm not there. If it's too easy, they may not engage. So it's really finding that zone of proximal development. Pacing and assessment and feedback need to go hand in hand. The pace of the learner is determined by the learner, and they're going through those success criteria. If you go back to what Karin was talking about, she had those standards unpacked into some sort of performance assessment criteria. The student needs to understand where they are in relationship to where they're going. And then the student-centered learning, I believe, in the classroom culture and engagement is really when you manifest or that student starts to realize, I am an active participant in my learning. I can make a choice to learn, and I know I've learned something. And then that cycle of success starts to spin forward. And really what a lot of this boils down to is going back to Hattie's visible learning. And I'm going to go just real quick with some of these. These are the 4 major strategies that Hattie focuses on in terms of, as teachers, we need to make sure that we instruct or teach students strategies in these 4 areas, but not only teach and instruct them, but continually allow them opportunities to access these strategies and get feedback on their use. That's how you start to see, it's not I gave it to you, now you go learn. It's a gradual shift in promoting their ability to own their process of learning. The first one, and I'm going to give you examples of each one of these. First one is the cognitive strategies. Think about that just right level work. Think about the value they bring to that learning experience, but making sure that it's still rigorous, right? So there's those cognitive strategies as defined by rigor. And the metacognitive strategies are really how they think about themselves as learners, or how they apply processes of thinking. And those are very important. And I think a lot of people, typically, if you know growth mindset feedback, they ask you to do feedback around process, not product. And I think those questions typically ask a student to think about their thinking. The next one is motivational strategies. And I think this is probably one that I believe is untapped potential in terms of technology interface. You think about these kiddos who will go and they'll do a TikTok forever, or they'll play a video game forever. They're getting some sort of validation or some sort of feedback intuitively in that. That's what motivates them. There's some efficacious feed or need that's being met with them. How do we transfer that reality into a situation that's around learning? And I think that efficacy and regulation and learning process, I'm going to show you a couple of slides for that. But I think if we can provide that training and that opportunity for teachers to really scale out what it is they want students to do, and a student to feel like, I put in a little bit of effort and I moved, or I put in a little bit of effort and I got immediate feedback, so I know how to do it better this time, or I felt success in doing it. I think those are those motivational strategies that promote engagement, and also will start to unearth and bridge over some inequities that may be occurring within that child's learning experience. And the last one is management strategies. I know one of the districts I'm working with, their solution to making sure kids are there on time and we're just going to go to block schedule. And that's a perfect example. That may allow for management and being a little bit more flexible in terms of managing their time and not having that everyday experience. But it's not enough just to go into a block schedule. You have to think about these other 3 strategies as well. So they're very much interrelated. And I'm going to just, over the next couple of slides, just go a little bit deeper into each one. So when you think about the shift in the role, We want to look at a learner as an assessment capable, visible learner. This is Hattie's work again. And this is a 0.73 effect size, which definitely is something you want to focus on and you want to work with. And it basically says that effective feedback is timely, specific, and includes actions the students take to further their learning. So think about it. If we truly have a pathway, a learning, a lesson plan, a unit plan, whatever, and we've got our standards unpacked, and we can create some sort of scaffold or steps of learning that could ultimately become our scale as well. The timely and specific is, where is that student in relationship to where they need to be? And what strategies do they need to activate to go to the next level? So it literally gives them a sense of momentum. It gives them a feeling of traction. And all of this starts with that clear learning intention, as well as that success criteria, which, if you think about it, Karin just really gave us a lot of tools to help identify those two valuable strategies that impart to put a student in there. And we want to think about, there's self-level feedback, which is basically some sort of validation. We never say good work, right? Because you can't really do anything with the feedback, good work. I notice what's your most proud piece of writing? Why are you proud of that? So that activates their self-system. Self-regulation, understanding you're on pace or off pace, or what do you need to do to get yourself back on pace. Process level is going to be a little bit more metacognition, and task level. So I'm going to go into each one of those right now. So when you think about the learner-centered culture, self level, this is a really neat tool. It's in our book, and also I'm pretty sure you can find it on the web. It's from Kettle Moraine. And what they're doing is it's learner disposition. It's what are those strategies we want students to activate so that they understand not only do they need to be in charge of their learning, but what is it they need to do to be in charge of their learning. And I think if teachers, thank you, Rose. And I think if teachers think about not just asking students to be in charge, but believing that they can be in charge, and think about where they are in terms of imparting these strategies, I think students will be more apt to go into it. In a live setting, student disengages, we can redirect. Not necessarily going to happen in a virtual setting, or when we ask them to do work without us being right there. So that's the self system. Self-regulation. Karin in her last, she showed the rope that was intertwining. Those are all those personal success skills built on the work study practices. Right now, the work I'm doing with Manchester, we've elevated work study practices to core competencies that are going to be integrated across the board. But I want you to think about, this is a wonderful scale. We have emerging to developing. We have a scale that has some sort of continuum to it. But I also want to direct your attention to this green. If you were to think of like the transition of going from live to virtual, you think about the strategies for self-regulation. I'm going to go right down to applying. Anticipate complexities of task completion and schedules, and explain how I adjusted my pace appropriately to meet agreed upon deadlines. If you were to take a couple minutes and ask students to think about where are they on this continuum, and help them activate strategies to go from emerging to developing and applying, or if you were to integrate this into your core instruction, you're allowing students to activate those strategies I talked about with the bubbles. I don't think we can just assume that kids come to us with these tools ready to go out the box. In fact, a lot of times they don't have them. A lot of times school becomes passive for students, whether they're either they find success easy, or they've learned how to play school. So I think we're missing an opportunity if we're not imparting these personal success skills, having kids apply them and give them feedback based on it, which is, if you remember that pencil, right? The next, okay, so this is process level feedback. This is, how do we get students to think about their thinking? I can't do this. I quit. This is too hard. Thank you. Karin and Rose are filling the blanks. I love you guys. So basically the self-system and metacognition process feedback, once again, I'm going back into the Hattie indicators, talks about strategies emphasizing student metacognition and self-regulated learning. if you remember back to Karen's presentation, at the very bottom of one of her scales, she had self-awareness. And those are going to be questions where you ask students to think about their thinking or how they got that answer. And we need to, it's not about getting it right or wrong and moving on. It's how do you know this is correct? Or what did you learn from this error and recorrecting it? So and also the transfer strategies. I think that 0.86 is a great opportunity for a hybrid situation. You give it to them in direct instruction, and then they have to transfer it to another situation that may not be in that classroom, right? It may be applicable to their situation in their daily lives. It almost forces us to activate that type of strategy in terms of having students think about their thinking. As I'm going through these are all ways that just help move that needle from teacher directed to student directed. And visible learning, the questions typically asked, our students should be able to answer, I know where I'm going, I have the tools for the journey, I can monitor my progress, I can tell you if I'm on pace or off pace, I can recognize what's next, and I know what to do next. So all of these are great guiding questions that we want learners to be able to own and answer throughout the process of learning. And here's an example of success criteria or task level feedback, really being very transparent and overt around what it is the success criteria is. What is it we want you to know and be able to do at the end of this learning process, which would be over here, would be that demonstrating proficiency. Took a target, unpacked it, created these scaffolds. You can imagine each one of these being a learning goal for a classroom. And also it allows me to say, with some sort of formative assessment, if you've cleared this standard, you're on this next standard. So it allows them to identify and access appropriate task level or their just right level work or zone of proximal development. You never say zone of proximal development to a student. You'd say your just right work. And that also sets the pace. So my teacher pace is up here. Where are you as a student? And then if they're not where they need to be, have them reflect on those strategies. How's your management strategies going right now? And it allows them to check and adjust. Once again, it's just being transparent. And on this side, it's the flow for the year. And that's your pathway, by the way. And here's a high school example. Exactly what I just said on the previous slide. You can pull it over to this slide. Yeah, it's 1 o'clock. Thanks. So I just have I'm going to end with 2 resources that I think are really good and I've been using them, and I've found teachers and administrators both finding a lot of use out of them. The first one is the Framework for Remote Teaching, the Danielson model. It's wonderful. I'm going to just kind of show you real quick, but it has self-reflection for teachers as well as goal setting. So it helps you can pick whatever domain you want and maybe have a really deep conversation. Use this for PD, or also activating what strategies do my teachers need? Let's not just guess. And then the last one is it offers a deeper dive into each one of these domains in the reality of a remote learning setting. And I'm going to actually go to the next one because it even has, I blew it up, how you use assessment for feedback in these 2 environments. Because I think there's a lot out there. It's just being a way to, I guess, curate what's out there and getting it into our teachers or getting it in front of our teachers with the understanding this is what I need, not another thing to look at. And then the last resource I wanted to show you is, and I'm going to share this presentation with you. I have links in a lot of my slides. This is an incredibly comprehensive document that has lots of samples. And I have found this to be an incredibly valuable tool for schools trying to identify what it is they need in any one of these areas and what some best practice or exemplars that are out there. And there it is. So I am gonna just basically end with, when you think about these challenges and opportunities, some of this stuff is in the book. Some of this is, oh wow, your friends are almost as cool as you. I chose that comment. So basically, we're trying to figure out we're trying to figure out best ways to help schools. And some of the best tools that are out there are having schools self-reflect on what they need. And I think the book helps us do that. And what we've done today is kind of take a slice out of that book and think about what are those opportunities and challenges CBE can address in terms of a remote learning setting. So